Hey John, what do you use to thin Tamiya paint? You got a minute? I've used Tamiya paints for years for airbrushing. Back when I was building aircraft, that was pretty much my exclusive go-to for anything that I built. And so I've had a lot of opportunities to see what works and what doesn't when it comes to thinning Tamiya's paints. Now, of course, Tamiya is just one of many great paints that are on the market. I use Vallejo and Citadel and Gunza and quite a few other brands for both brush painting and airbrushing. So they're not unique out in the market, but I think they have a very special place for a few reasons. First of all, they're very easy to find. Most model shops that I've visited over the years, they tend to have Tamiya paints. They may have others, but Tamiya is one that you're generally going to find on the shelves. Most places that sell paints online, you're going to find them there also. So getting them, in fact, it's really across the world. There's some brands that if I recommend or I'm looking for, depending on where you live, they may be harder to get. But Tamiya seems to be fairly ubiquitous, which means they're in lots of places, I think. Another thing that's great about them is they're just very flexible. When it comes to airbrushing, as I'm going to talk about in a few minutes, there's a lot of things that you can thin them with, and they're really forgiving. They're not the kind of paint that, you know, you have to get a precise mixing ratio and you have to use specific products. You know, it's pretty much, there's a whole lot of stuff that you can thin them with, so they're very flexible. They're also very affordable. Of all the paints that I buy, whether I'm getting the smaller 10 milliliter bottles or the larger 23 milliliter bottles, they're very affordable on a per milliliter basis, and you're not going to break the bank getting those paints. They also last a long time. I've got bottles of Tamiya paint that I'll find in some drawer somewhere that I'll look at and go, this has to be at least 10 years old. And at most, I put in maybe a few extra drops of thinner, spin it up with my little stirring tool of spinniness, and they're good to go. So they're really, really good in that regard too. Another thing I like about them is they dry very, very flat. I like my paint to go on flat initially. Now, if I want it to be gloss, I'll add some gloss to it. I'll put a gloss coat over it. But for the most part, I want my paints to be flat. And Tamiya paints are some of the flattest that I've found. And they're not so dead flat that they're chalky looking, but they just don't really have any gloss to them, unless, of course, you get their gloss paints. Now, admittedly, there are a couple of drawbacks to Tamiya paints. One is their color range just really isn't that great when it comes to the bottled paints. I think it's somewhere around 100, 120, something like that. And in the more military range of colors, they've got quite a few good paints for specific purposes, but a lot of it is, you got a lot of grays and a lot of greens and a lot of browns, you know, and then there's just a few blues and things like that. So it's not the greatest range in the world, you know, like when you're talking about something like Vallejo, which I've heard they have as many as 700 different colors. But it's not a drawback that ever slowed me down, because I very quickly found out, okay, if I want to just mix these two together, I'll mix them up really quick. So it is a drawback, but it can be overcome. And another drawback is they're not really easy to brush paint. You can brush paint them, but it's not always easy. They're not the best for that. But I still think they are about the best thing going, all things considered, when it comes to airbrushing. To make sure that I'm not confusing anybody, when I'm talking about Tamiya paints in this video, I'm not talking about their enamels, I'm not talking about their lacquer paints. I'm talking about this kind of paint, what we call their acrylics. Tamiya acrylics while they do have some water in them, they're not technically water-based paints. In some ways, they're still more like a lacquer. I've heard, I think it was Lincoln Wright, I've heard refer to them more than a few times as hybrid acrylics, because yeah, they got some water, but that's not what you thin them with. But whatever the case is, this is the stuff I'm talking about. Now, quite often I hear modelers say, well, to me, it's just alcohol based. You just thin it with alcohol. And as we'll talk about, yeah, you can, but that's not what they're made of. If you do a search for MSDS and then the name of the product, I did a search for MSDS Tamiya paint, and one of the paints that was listed in that Google search was their X1, which is a gloss, I think it's black paint. But you can see that the list of ingredients is more than just alcohol. It's actually a lot of different alcohols, if I understand my chemistry right, and I'm no chemist. But there's some water in there, but there's a whole lot of other stuff that goes into it. So they're not just alcohol paints, and they're certainly not mostly water-based. So using that information, we can then go and find some other things that thin these paints good and then really good. Now, in most cases, when people are asking me just a general, what should I thin a paint with? And they'll name any brand. My first answer is usually, okay, start with the manufacturer's recommended thinner, whatever that may be. Most manufacturers make some kind of thinner for their paint. And they'll tell you, you know, for brush painting, use this amount. For airbrushing, use this amount. Generally, if you're not sure, if you're just starting in the hobby, go with the manufacturer's recommendation and then start adjusting from there. Now, Tamiya recommends for their paints these X20A thinners. It's a great thinner for their paints. It works really, really well. I've used this for many years. I've never had any problems with it. The paint will airbrush really smooth. You don't get really a lot of tip dry with Tamiya paints, or I haven't. And it's easy to find this stuff, and it's not, in terms of thinners, it's not real expensive. But this is, if you're not sure what to thin your Tamiya paints with, this is the one to start with. I also like this because while it does have an odor, it's fairly low odor when compared to the other options that I'm going to talk about here in just a few minutes. So if this is all you use for airbrushing your Tamiya paints, you're not going to have any problems. Now, another thinner that I use from Tamiya that works really well is their lacquer thinner. Now, if the X20A is a cheeseburger, this is a double cheeseburger. It works better than X20A. And I want to qualify that. There's absolutely no problem that I've found using X20A. So it's very good. This stuff seems to be even better. So don't hear that it's a case of bad and good. It's a case of good and better. This stuff is really good. The paint is going to go on super smooth. It's going to flow really nice. Your airbrush will clean up really easily afterwards. This is some good stuff. However, it's got a case of the stank all over it. This is not low odor by any means. It's very high odor. So it's something that you need to take proper safety precautions when airbrushing. You should always do that when airbrushing. But this is no joke. You really want to wear a respirator. You really want to have good airflow. You don't want, your family sitting around watching you while this stuff is blowing up in their face. It's great stuff, but it comes at a cost. Now, there's some other lacquer type thinners that work really well with Tamiya paints. This is what I was talking about earlier when I said they're really flexible. There's some other lacquer type thinners from other manufacturers that work really well with Tamiya paints. The go-tos that I have on my bench are from Gunza and from AK Interactive. Now, the AK Interactive stuff, and I'm just going to go over these kind of one by one, this stuff works about like the Tamiya lacquer thinner. It's really good. It's a little better than X20A in terms of how it sprays, how smooth it goes on, those kind of things. It's actually a lower odor alternative. Again, it's still not, you know, something you don't want to have proper ventilation and a respirator for, but it's a much lower odor alternative, and it works really well with the Tamiya paints. Now the Mr. Color Thinner is also a great option. It's got a little more odor to it, but it's going to work like the AK Interactive and the Tamiya Lacquer Thinner in that it's going to be smooth application, flows through the airbrush great, cleans up really easy. And one of the things I forgot to mention in terms of these lacquer type thinners is they adhere to the model really, really well. So they're super strong in terms of their bond, both over primer and over plastic, which I'm going to talk about in a minute. So this is another great alternative. Now, as much as I like the X20A, the Tamiya lacquer thinner, the other lacquer thinners that I've talked about, my secret sauce when it comes to, and it's not just mine, my secret sauce when it comes to spraying Tamiya paints is this Mr. Color Leveling Thinner. This stuff is my #1 go-to in almost every situation just because it works so well. It has all of the things that you want in a thinner. It can thin the paint down so that it's very thin and lets you build up layers and do transparencies and things like that. You can use just a little of it and get heavier coverage. It dries really quickly so that you can get some on there and you can let it dry out just a few minutes and you can start putting other paint over it. Its adherence to the model is really, really good. If I'm going to be doing a lot of masking, I'm going to definitely be using something that's lacquer based and thinned with Mr. Color Leveling Thinner, because that's going to stick to the model better than anything else that I've used. Now, this is one of the stanky ones. Again, it's with any of the airbrushing that I'm talking about, you have to wear a respirator. But this one is a little more stanky, but with a respirator and good airflow, there's not going to be any problems with it. Now, in talking about how well this adheres to plastic, quite often I actually use Tamiya paint thinned with Mr. Color Leveling Thinner as both a primer and a paint coat on many models. I did this for years when I was painting aircraft. I didn't always put down a primer coat. I would simply thin my Tamiya paints with Mr. Color Leveling Thinner, put an overall coat, say on the underside of an aircraft of one color, and then the other color on the top of the aircraft, and then everything else would go over that. And it adheres as good or better than any primer. I would take this stuff and Tamiya paint over any acrylic primer any day. It adheres to plastic that well. Now, as I mentioned earlier, Tamiya paints are very flexible and you can use a lot of different thinners. And there are some alternative thinners that I have used from time to time for special purposes. One is just simple isopropyl alcohol. Now, this is not something that I would recommend using as your primary paint coat. The adhesion of the paint to the model is reduced when you're using alcohol. I certainly wouldn't use it as my primary coat of paint. But what alcohol is great for, in my opinion, is doing various effects. Like if you want to do some post shading or post fading, or maybe some exhaust staining, or just applying coats of paint that are very transparent over other paints, maybe for streaking or soot effects or anything like that. Thinning Tamiya paints with alcohol is great because the paint goes on very transparent, it doesn't break apart, and the alcohol dries really, really fast so that you don't have to worry about spidering where the paint, you know, spreads all out in almost a spider-shaped pattern or things like that. You can do some really good effects when you're using alcohol. That's my go-to for any kind of post-paint work. Like I said, whether it's post-shading, post-fading, or anything like that. you can get some really, really amazing effects using alcohol. But again, I don't recommend it as a primary thinner for base coats. Now, other things that people have asked me about, they've asked, do you use Pledge or Future? I have tried it, and it does work sort of, kinda. When I've thinned any paint with Pledge or Future and used it, it goes on very glossy, as you would expect. It's very durable, as you would expect, but it is super, super low opacity. It's very transparent, and it's difficult if you're trying to build up a base coat. You've got to paint and paint and paint and paint to get that on there. So yes, you can use it, but it's not one I would recommend, especially for Tamiya paints. If you're trying to build up a glossy look to your Tamiya paints, then I would just use their gloss additive or buy one of their gloss paints. Those are going to work much better. Now, another thing that I hear folks talking about is using water to thin Tamiya paints. Now, I've heard this. I've never thought intuitively it should work, because when you look at the material safety data sheet and see all of the things that are in Tamiya paints and in their thinners, I don't think it should work well. I've seen a really good demonstration that Martin Kovacs did over on Night Shift Scale Models, where he was showing how to do his rain marks mix, and he mixed some Tamiya paints with water and it just clumped up. I know some folks who say, oh yeah, that's all I've ever used is water, and they say it works for them. The times I've tried it, it hasn't worked for me. So if you're using it and it's working for you, you know, hey, great. If you're considering it, I would say try something other than water. Now, anytime I'm discussing what to thin paints with, the question always comes up, what ratio should I thin paints with? And my fallback answer to that is always, you want to thin it to about the consistency of skim milk. And I say that because if you're not familiar with thinning paints in an airbrush, saying, well, get it really thin, and saying, thin it so that it airbrushes nicely, isn't always the most helpful thing. But most of us can relate to milk. And I've done this. Early on, I did this, and several people that I mentioned this to said they did it and it was helpful. I actually just put a little bit of skim milk in my airbrush to say, okay, what does it look like? When I swirl around in the cup, what does it look like? So in general, that's about how thin you want your paints from any brand, although it can vary, when you're thinning for painting, for airbrushing. Now, with Tamiya paints, my go-to thinning ratio is roughly 50-50, 50% paint and 50% thinner. That'll give me a good base coat that flows nicely, lays down smooth, it's not going on heavy and clogging anything up. It can vary a little between colors. Some of the grays and blues I've found work better with a little more thinning. Some paints can stand with a little less thinning. But that 50-50 ratio is a good starting point. And then it's only after that that I start adding more thinner depending on the effect that I'm going to be doing. For example, if I'm freehanding a camouflage pattern, then I'll generally start with something that's thinner than that, maybe 60% thinner, 70% thinner. And that gives me a little more control to go in and really trace in that fine line to establish the demarcation of camouflage. If I'm doing post-shading effects, I may go down to 90% thinner, 10% paint. That's where the alcohol can sometimes come in really well for the airbrushing, not the drinking. Don't airbrush and, you know, it'll just look weird. But anyway, Tamiya paints are very flexible in that way that you can thin them way down and they still tend to have their integrity when airbrushing. But to flog this just a little further, the starting point I recommend is 50-50. If I had to choose one thinner that I use with Tamiya paints from now on and had no alternative, I would go with the Mr. Color Leveling Thinner. Yeah, it's a little more odoriferous, but it works so well that this would be my go-to. Now, if you're wanting something that's a little lower odor, but still has great lacquer properties, consider the AK Interactive Real Color Thinner. That works really well too, and it's lower odor. But any of the thinners that I've talked about, the lacquer-based or the Tamiya X20A, are going to work really well as your base coating. Just put paint on, even effects. The alcohol works a little better for the effects in my opinion, but you can still do a really good job with any of these thinners that I've talked about. Well, I hope this video has been helpful. It's a simple topic. I probably could have got away with just talking about this for 2 minutes and then being done with it. You're probably wishing at this point I would have, but oh well, here we are. But it is important, and it is something that I think is something I get a lot of questions about from newer modelers and from people that are new to airbrushing. So hopefully this has been helpful, giving you some things to think about, some things to try, and maybe answered a few questions. Well, thank you so much for watching this video, especially if you're still here at this point. I'm always grateful for the folks who hang around till the very end. That really helps, because I see in the analytics, because if you've ever looked at YouTube video analytics, you get about 10% into the video and all of a sudden it just goes like that. I don't know why that is, but that's just the case. But thank you for hanging around and for watching this video. I would be most grateful if you would hit the little subscribe button over here and maybe hit that bell icon so you can subscribe to the channel and know when I have new videos. I'm trying to grow the channel, and that would really help me out a lot. It would also help me if you would hit the like button for this and maybe drop a comment below. That's, again, stuff that YouTube notices and helps me try and crack into that algorithm. So I would be thankful if you would do that. There's also information down below about how you can support this channel, and I would be most grateful if you would check out one of those avenues, either through Patreon or right here on YouTube. And if you're already a supporter, whether it's here on YouTube or on Patreon, thank you so much. As I've said many times, and I really mean it, it's the support that y'all give me that makes what I do possible. I just couldn't model at the pace that I do with the equipment and the materials that I do if it weren't for your support. So thank you very much. It's a blessing to me, and it's a blessing to my family. And with all of that being said, I'll leave you with one final thought, as I always like to do. In this hobby, if you're not having fun, you're doing it wrong. Happy day to you, friends. Bye-bye.